Today we're talking about surface dyslexia, which is an absolutely fascinating phenomenon and occasionally an extremely helpful clinical sign in cognitive neurology. Surface dyslexia is the phenomenon whereby a reader will regularize the reading of irregularly spelled words. So for example, instead of reading this word as colonel, they might read it as colonel. Instead of reading this word as night, they might read it as knight. And instead of reading this word as yacht, they might read it as yacht. In order to understand why this happens, it's important to have at least a simplified understanding of the neuroscience of reading. When a mature reader reads, they do so by activating two simultaneous pathways. They both begin in the left occipital lobe after some initial pre-processing of visual word information. And then the two reading pathways are firstly a phonemic reading pathway that progresses more dorsally, and then a semantic reading pathway that progresses more ventrally. The phonemic pathway is required in order to decode the phonemes of the words that are being read. That is, it's the phonetic reading pathway. And that's how most of us in English will have learned to read, through phonics or learning to sound out words. The semantic reading pathway, in contrast, is also known as the whole word reading pathway. It's what enables us to read irregular words, which rely on our semantic knowledge of how they're pronounced, because their pronunciation cannot be straightforwardly or at all derived from the spelling of the words. In surface dyslexia, there's dysfunction of this semantic reading pathway. Because we no longer have the semantic reading pathway to allow us access to the knowledge of how irregularly spelled words are pronounced, we become entirely dependent on this phonemic reading pathway. Hence, when we come to read a word like colonel, we can't simply directly access the meaning of the word and tie it to its known pronunciation. We have to sound out each of the phonemes according to the spelling. So surface dyslexia results from destruction of this semantic reading pathway. In contrast, because the phonemic reading pathway in surface dyslexia is fine, we are still able to read words which actually don't even exist, they're nonsense words or non-words, provided they have a plausible phonological composition. For example, someone with surface dyslexia will still be able to read these non-words as bleg, srock, or nart. It's important to appreciate that surface dyslexia is actually a language-dependent phenomenon, and it's particularly well suited for detection in English, because in English we have a good deal of regularity to our spelling, but we also have many, many irregularly spelled words as well, and more generally irregularities in our spelling conventions. In contrast, other languages, for example Italian, are sometimes much more phonetically regular than English. In Italian, there are essentially no irregularly spelled words at all. For example, this sentence here, even though I don't speak any Italian, I can tell you would roughly be pronounced la volpe marrone rapida salta sopra il cane pigro. And probably my accent was terrible, but nonetheless, the fact that I'm able to read that out roughly phonologically accurately speaks to how regular the spelling of the Italian language is. Other languages still, like Japanese for example, have much more complicated orthographies. Japanese has 3 writing systems. That includes 2 phonetic writing systems, hiragana and katakana, hiragana for native words and katakana for foreign words and brands and things like that. But then it also has kanji, Chinese character logographs that directly imply meaning without any phonetic information associated with them. And then sentences in Japanese, in written Japanese, are composed typically with a combination of hiragana and kanji plus minus some katakana. So when we think about the phenomenon of surface dyslexia in Italian, because the written language is so regular, surface dyslexia essentially doesn't exist as a phenomenon because all of the words in Italian can be decoded using just the phonemic reading pathway if necessary. In Japanese, in contrast, surface dyslexia manifests quite intriguingly as a total loss of ability to read kanji, but a preserved ability to read hiragana and katakana because they are very regular phonetic writing systems. Similarly, someone who, for example, is natively bilingual in Mandarin and English, if they develop surface dyslexia, they might have clear surface dyslexia in English, but have a total loss of ability or total alexia for Chinese characters, but perhaps preserved ability to read pinyin. Why is this clinically useful? As I said, surface dyslexia suggests that there's dysfunction or destruction of particularly of the semantic reading pathway, which particularly makes us think about the anterior temporal lobe, and in the appropriate clinical context may support a diagnosis of semantic variant primary progressive aphasia, where the location of the pathology and the peak site of atrophy is the anterior temporal lobe of the dominant hemisphere. Indeed, surface dyslexia is one of the supportive criteria in the classification of semantic variant primary progressive aphasia. There are some caveats, though, that I'd like to mention about assessing surface dyslexia. First of all, in a patient for whom English is their second language, it's important not to overstate the finding of surface pronunciation of irregularly spelled words on testing, because that may simply reflect the fact that they've learned English later on in life, and so they don't have as robust a semantic vocabulary for various irregular words. Learning to read English with all of its irregularities is very difficult, even as a native English-speaking child, let alone for an adult trying to learn English as their second language. In a related sense, it's also important to appreciate that if you don't know the pronunciation of an irregularly spelled word, and therefore pronounce it with a surface pronunciation, that could just reflect a semantic knowledge issue. Even in people for whom English is their first language, for particularly less common words that are irregularly spelled, they might not know how to pronounce them. For example, rather embarrassingly, for a very long time, well into my mid-20s, I thought that the word quinoa was pronounced quinoa when read aloud. Thirdly, there is a small proportion of people who have a developmental surface dyslexia, and for whom it might be an isolated or insignificant finding, particularly if mild. On the right here, I have the list of words present in the Addenbrooke's cognitive examination, the ACE, that are there for the purpose of screening for surface dyslexia. It wouldn't be uncommon, for example, for someone to, particularly if they have English as their second language, to pronounce this word here as pint. However, if you had multiple of these words all pronounced in a surface fashion, su, pint, suit, daug, hiked, then that would make me very suspicious. My general clinical approach is that, depending on the clinical context, if someone gets one, or certainly if they get more than one wrong of this list, then I go on to test that more robustly with a longer list dedicated to evaluating more comprehensively for surface dyslexia. However, if the clinical history and the remainder of the cognitive examination is not particularly suggestive, and it was an isolated surface pronunciation of a single word on this list, I wouldn't necessarily think too much about it. Similarly, I also wouldn't think too much about it if someone initially says the surface pronunciation, but immediately self-corrects themselves. Now, the flip side is, if the history actually is suggestive of a primary progressive aphasia, and particularly if there are other features on the cognitive screening that might suggest it's a semantic variant, then even if these words were pronounced correctly, I still would probably go on to test that more robustly to see if there's more subtle but convincing surface dyslexia on more comprehensive testing. Now, as a bonus to finish up with, there is the phenomenon of surface dysgraphia, which is essentially the written analogue of surface dyslexia. So this is where someone is entirely dependent on their phonemic writing pathway. And so, kind of analogously, or exactly analogously to surface dyslexia, if these people are asked to spell and write out the spelling of an irregularly spelled word, then they will write it in a phonetic way because they don't have semantic access to the knowledge of the irregular spelling. So, for example, if someone had surface dysgraphia and they were asked to spell the word kernel, instead of writing it with the correct irregular spelling, they might write it Kernel. And night, like knight in shining armor from before, they might instead spell it Nite. And yacht, they might just spell Yot. Quite commonly, surface dyslexia and surface dysgraphia go together. Lastly, I'll just make a comment about the spectrum of regularity, noting that in English, the demarcation between regular and irregular word spelling is actually not very well defined, and English is littered with inconsistencies in the pronunciation of various words. For example, consider O-U-G-H. In this word, it's through, and it makes an oo sound, but then we have though, tough, and thought. Here we have cove, clove, but love, glove, and then move. And here we have the word tomb, but bomb, and then comb. As a consequence, it is somewhat or slightly arbitrary what we ultimately decide is an irregularly spelled word or not, but certainly when testing for surface dyslexia, we want words which are not super frequent, but also not super rare, but ideally unambiguously irregular, like kernel or yacht. That's why having these two simultaneously operating reading pathways is so important, because each one keeps the other on track. And someone with surface dyslexia may exhibit phonological errors more generally in their reading, because they no longer have the semantic reading pathway to keep them on track. So there you have it. That's surface dyslexia, the phenomenon whereby a reader will regularize the reading of irregularly spelled words, especially in English. It results from dysfunction or destruction of the semantic reading pathway, leaving someone entirely dependent on their phonemic reading pathway, and in the correct clinical context is particularly suggestive of or supportive of a diagnosis of semantic variant primary progressive aphasia. That's all I have to say about that. But as a final thought to leave you with, what would the opposite of surface dyslexia look like? Because it is true that there is such a thing as deep dyslexia, where instead of a dysfunctional semantic reading pathway, you have a dysfunctional phonemic reading pathway. So have a think about how that would manifest in terms of the signs that we've talked about. I will say, though, that that is, especially in isolation, a much, much rarer phenomenon, and certainly nowhere near as clinically useful in day-to-day cognitive assessment.